Did JFK have a secret back channel to the Kremlin? Hello, and this is the first episode of a brand new series called JFK's Hidden Strategies. This series will explore previously classified documents from the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum to bring you untold stories about his presidency, his life, and his times. I'll be your host for this series. I'm a historian and the author of 6 books on the Kennedy presidency, including The Kennedy Detail, a thriller set in the world of the Kennedy assassination. Coming up later this month, November, is the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it's hard to believe that we got through it without nuclear war. But there were many close calls during those 13 very tense days in October of 1962, and one of them may have involved a secret back channel that President Kennedy had established to the Soviet embassy here in Washington, D.C. The existence of this back channel was kept top secret for more than 50 years, and only now, with the release of these documents, do we have full knowledge of what took place. So let me introduce you to the main players in this tale. Robert Kennedy, the president's younger brother and the Attorney General of the United States, he was one of the few people who knew about this back channel. J. John McCone, director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Charles Douglas Dillon, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. And then over at the Soviet embassy, Anatoly Dobrynin, the Soviet ambassador to the United States. All of these men played significant roles during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but their involvement in this secret back channel has been largely unknown until now. And so let's dive into this story. On October 22, 1962, President Kennedy addressed the American people on the Cuban Missile Crisis. He told them that the U.S. had discovered that the Soviets had placed missiles in Cuba capable of reaching the United States with nuclear weapons. In response to this threat, Kennedy announced a naval blockade of Cuba and demanded the removal of the missiles. He made it clear that any attempt by the Soviets to supply those missiles with nuclear warheads would be considered an attack on the United States. And that announcement brought the world to the edge of nuclear war. But behind the scenes, there was a secret diplomatic effort underway between the United States and the Soviet Union. It was not officially sanctioned by either government. It was outside the normal diplomatic channels, so they call it a back channel. Robert Kennedy, the president's brother and the Attorney General, he was one of the few people who knew about it. He described it as an informal channel of communication that existed between the highest levels of the U.S. and Soviet governments. It was a way for the two sides to communicate directly with each other without going through formal diplomatic channels. The back channel was established in the summer of 1962. Robert Kennedy asked the CIA to set it up so that he could communicate directly with the Soviet ambassador here in Washington. Now, why did he want to do that? Well, because Robert Kennedy, along with JFK, believed that the official diplomatic channels between the two countries were too rigid and too slow. They wanted to be able to communicate more quickly and directly with the Soviets, especially when it came to sensitive or controversial topics like the situation in Cuba. Now, the CIA set up a safe house in a suburb of Washington where the meetings took place. The Soviets were allowed to select the location, and the meetings were always held during the day so there would be no chance of being overheard at night. The back channel consisted of 3 main participants: Robert Kennedy, the Soviet ambassador Dobrynin, and John McCone, the director of the CIA. Now, what did they talk about in these meetings? Well, they talked about everything. They discussed the possibility of war. They discussed the status of U.S.-Soviet relations, and they also discussed the situation in Cuba. For example, on September 28th, Robert Kennedy met with Ambassador Dobrynin and Director McCone at the safe house. Robert Kennedy said that the purpose of the meeting was to tell the Soviets that the U.S. government wanted to find a way out of the crisis. He claimed that the Americans weren't interested in destroying the Soviets or starting a war, and he asked Dobrynin to convey that message to Khrushchev. Kennedy also warned the ambassador that if the U.S. found any offensive weapons on the island, military action was inevitable. Another meeting took place on October 24th, 2 days after President Kennedy's famous address to the American people. Robert Kennedy told Dobrynin that he personally approved of the naval blockade, but that he wasn't sure that the president had the authority to impose it. He said that the president felt backed into a corner and that if the Soviets didn't remove the missiles, Kennedy would have no choice but to take action. Dobrynin responded by saying that the Soviet ships still planned to continue on to Cuba, and that if they were stopped, it would be considered an act of war. He said that Khrushchev was prepared to risk war over the issue and that the Soviet leader would never give in. Robert Kennedy replied that if the ships were stopped, President Kennedy would consider it an act of war and he would order the Air Force to strike. These meetings were taking place just days before the world would learn that a Soviet ship had run into a U.S. Navy blockade, which led to the capture of several Soviet missiles bound for Cuba. Those missiles were paraded around the aircraft carrier and shown to the world's press, and that event pushed the world closer to nuclear war. Robert Kennedy continued to meet with Ambassador Dobrynin after that incident, and he even went to the Soviet embassy one night to tell the ambassador that President Kennedy had made the decision to invade Cuba. But then, on October 28th, after the Soviets agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade the island, those secret meetings ended. Why am I telling you all of this? Because for more than 50 years, the existence of this back channel remained top secret. Only now are we learning about the critical role that it played during those 13 very tense days. These newly declassified documents reveal the personal stories behind the headlines of one of the most important events in world history. We know that President Kennedy was willing to authorize the use of military force to remove Soviet missiles from Cuba, and we know that Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev was willing to risk nuclear war to keep them. But what we didn't know before was the existence of this secret back channel and its impact on the decision-making process. This is important because it shows that even during the height of the Cold War, when the stakes were at their highest, the U.S. and Soviet leaders were able to communicate directly with each other, and that communication helped to prevent a nuclear disaster. And here's another interesting thing. This back channel almost certainly saved the life of the U.S. pilot that we call Captain Powers. Captain Powers was a U.S. Air Force pilot who was shot down while on a top-secret spying mission over Cuba. The Soviets had him in their sights and they wanted to put him on trial for his actions. But as the Cuban Missile Crisis heated up, Captain Powers' fate became entangled in the diplomatic discussions between the U.S. and Soviet governments. Robert Kennedy asked Dobrynin to intervene on Powers' behalf and secure his release. And in return, Kennedy promised that the U.S. wouldn't take any military action against Cuba. That promise gave the Soviets enough leverage to force the Cubans to drop all charges against Captain Powers. And then he was released and returned safely to the United States. It's a great story, and it's a reminder that even in the darkest days of the Cold War, there is always hope for peace. I hope you enjoyed this first episode of JFK's Hidden Strategies. If you did, please subscribe to this channel and leave a comment below. I love reading your comments, and I'll see you next time.